2015 marks the 20th anniversary of the Sony PlayStation's launch in North America, and now's a good time to look back at the games that defined the 32-bit generation. The PlayStation hardware's origin story is pretty interesting. In the early 90s, Sony springboarded off of its failed Super Nintendo CD-ROM peripheral in order to manufacture its own console, the PlayStation. In doing so, it established a brand that remains a key part of the games industry decades later. The games released during the PlayStation's first year tell their own story, however. It was a time for experimentation and innovation. It was a time when many established developers created their first 3D worlds, whether they were ready to or not. It was a time that saw the release of all-time greats and some fascinating failures. This is PlayStation, Year 1. Toshinden was one of the PlayStation's first 10 games available at launch in the United States, debuting alongside the PlayStation hardware itself on September 9th, 1995. It established an early set of expectations for Sony's console, and put it in close competition with Sega's Saturn, released several months prior. Toshinden is a 3D weapons-based fighter featuring a small cast of characters. There's Eiji and Kaien, the game's Ryu and Ken equivalents. There's Foe, a chattering old man with claws for hands. And then there's Sophia, a whip-wielding dominatrix type with a really overdone Russian accent.
Thundering! Thundering!
Sophia played a large role in the PlayStation's marketing stateside, featuring in several magazine advertisements at the time. Despite their limited number of polygons, Toshinden's characters have a great degree of, well, character, making them distinct and memorable enough to front a major console advertising campaign. A smart move on Sony's part. Gameplay-wise, Battle Arena Toshinden plays somewhat like SNK's Neo Geo fighter Samurai Showdown. Players have 4 attack buttons, 2 slashes and 2 kicks, each of varying strength. Street Fighter-like button commands trigger fireballs and other special attacks, and once a character's life meter hits a critical point, they can launch desperation moves that drain a huge amount of their opponent's health if they connect. You shouldn't expect the kind of complexity you'd find in Capcom or SNK fighters, though. Attacks tend to knock your opponent's back pretty far, making it difficult to string together combos. Also, some characters' special attacks are so effective that there's little reason to use any of their other moves. Toshinden's defining feature is its 3D movement. You can use the PlayStation controller's shoulder buttons to roll toward or away from the game's camera and evade enemy attacks. It's a simple but effective addition. Dodging lets you easily close the gap on an opponent who's spamming projectile attacks, for instance, letting you get up close for a counterattack. While Toshinden isn't the best-looking PlayStation fighter compared to, say, Tekken, Soul Blade, and others that would follow, it struck a critical blow against Sega's pack-in Saturn game Virtua Fighter. Now, Virtua Fighter is definitely the better game. It has a depth and balance that Toshinden lacks, gameplay-wise. Putting them both side by side, though, Toshinden emerged as a clear winner in terms of presentation. The Sega Saturn was rushed to market early with rough-looking arcade conversions of Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA. Both ports played fine, but they shared a jittery, unfinished look that made them look kinda amateurish compared to Toshinden's smooth frame rate and comparatively slick presentation. Sega would later adapt to the hardware and release upgraded versions of both games with Virtua Fighter Remix and Daytona USA CCE, but at launch, Virtua Fighter especially suffered as a result of rushed development and hardware inexperience. Battle Arena Toshinden was developed by Tamsoft, a Japanese contract developer who was founded in 1992. This was their first credited game. Toshinden's Japanese publisher, Takara, had recently produced 16-bit ports of Neo Geo games like Samurai Showdown and Fatal Fury. Now, I can't confirm this, but I suspect that Takara saw its success with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis ports of Samurai Showdown, and then they approached Tamsoft with a pitch like, "Hey guys, you should make Samurai Showdown, but like, you know, in 3D and stuff." Thus Toshinden was born. Toshinden was one of the most successful launch titles for the PlayStation, and it saw multiple re-releases and sequels. There are 4 games in the core Toshinden series for the PlayStation, along with a Virtua Fighter Kids-like spin-off called Ni Toshinden, and Puzzle Arena Toshinden, which is a block-dropping puzzle game of all things. Developer Tamsoft never quite achieved the same level of success as it had with Toshinden. Well, at least during the original PlayStation's lifespan. Tamsoft tried to springboard off of Toshinden's popularity by self-publishing its PS1 RPG Guardians Crusade in Japan, but when that fell flat, they went right back to contract development for other publishers. Interestingly, Tamsoft would become notorious in the PlayStation 2 era through its involvement with publisher D3's Simple 2000 series in Japan. Originally a publishing label for low-priced, low-effort sports games with titles like The Bowling and The Billiards, the Simple series spun off in a bizarre direction on the PS2. That's when D3 started to focus on grindhouse-styled games like The Zombie vs. Ambulance and The Miniskirt Police. Tamsoft's releases under the Simple 2000 label include The Daibijin, or The Big Beautiful Woman, a game in which you control a heavily armed helicopter who has to take down a gigantic woman as she rampages through a city. Tamsoft's biggest success in recent years was with the One-chan-bara, a series of 3D action games that are built on a foundation of boobs and gore. What you see here is a sequel for the Nintendo Wii. It was released in North America as One-chan-bara Bikini Zombie Slayers, which pretty much tells you all you need to know about the game right there in the title. Though Tamsoft would only find its true calling years later, Arena Toshinden was an important release for the PlayStation. It gave players an early glimpse at the console's capabilities and its capacity for playable, if limited, 3D fighting games. Better Fighters would be released almost immediately, rendering Toshinden obsolete not even a year after its debut, but as a launch game, it was a simple and effective introduction to the world of PlayStation. For those of you who either don't remember or have blocked it from your memory, there was actually a live-action movie based on Capcom's landmark arcade fighting game, Street Fighter II. Titled Street Fighter, and released in 1994, it starred Belgian martial arts superstar Jean-Claude Van Damme as Colonel William Guile, and classically trained actor Raoul Julia as the evil dictator M. Bison. Needless to say, the film took several liberties with its source material, and while the end result has its moments, it's not very well regarded. It's a minor miracle that it shaped up as well as it did. I recommend reading the Polygon feature Street Fighter the Movie, What Went Wrong, which goes into detail about the many problems first-time director Steven D'Souza faced during production. In short, the movie had an unmissable release date, Capcom made a series of ridiculous demands during filming that resulted in major last-minute changes, and a large chunk of its budget was spent hiring its two principal actors. The game adaptation of Street Fighter the Movie, that would make it Street Fighter the Movie the Game, I suppose, also has a troubled history. During the movie's production, Capcom hired on Chicago-based arcade developer Incredible Technologies to capture digitized footage of its actors for use in two different fighting games. Grabbing this footage was a chore for pretty much everyone. Actors had to coat themselves in a thick layer of baby oil and stand under the boiling heat of a massive lighting setup, performing martial arts moves that they were often not trained to perform while standing on top of a rotating platform. The arcade version of Street Fighter the Movie was developed by Incredible Technologies themselves. I won't go into it too much because the footage you see of it here really speaks for itself. Incredible Technologies had previously developed Time Killers and Bloodstorm, a pair of absolutely terrible arcade fighting games that attempted to capture a share of Mortal Kombat's market with ridiculous levels of graphic violence and bloodshed. To an extent, Street Fighter the Movie is also an attempt to siphon Mortal Kombat's market share with its use of digitized actors, but the PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions feature gameplay much more similar to Street Fighter than Mortal Kombat. While the arcade and console versions of Street Fighter the Movie were built using the same digitized footage, they are completely different games, with distinct engines and gameplay. The PlayStation and Saturn versions of Street Fighter the Movie were developed by an internal Capcom studio, and as a result, they play like a modified version of Super Street Fighter II Turbo. The gameplay is very similar, the timing and pacing are on point, and every character even has a super move, which was, at the time, a very recent addition for the series. While the arcade version developed by Incredible Technologies uses a lot more digitized footage for its own interpretation of the Street Fighter formula, Capcom smartly decided to pick and choose individual frames of the digitized actors to recreate character sprites from Super Street Fighter II Turbo. The result looks kinda goofy at times, but Capcom's approach was definitely the right one, and if you can look past the game's unusual presentation, it's a very solid fighter. In addition to traditional tournament and versus modes, the PlayStation and Saturn versions of Street Fighter the Movie also feature a movie battle mode, which blends Street Fighter's gameplay with a visual novel in an attempt to recreate the movie's story. Players can make decisions at several branching paths, affecting which fighters they encounter during the story, though the ending is always the same. Movie battle mode is unusual for several reasons. It starts with an unwinnable battle against Bison, which is the sort of thing that makes sense in an RPG where you can level up your characters and eventually become stronger than your enemies, but it makes no sense in a fighting game where you have the exact same abilities at the end of the game as you did at the beginning. Also, you can only play as Guile, which takes some adjustment if you're not used to playing as charge-based characters. I swear it cheats, too. Guile deals very little damage compared to his opponents, and I've seen the AI pull off instant charge moves and other attacks that would be impossible for a human player to do. By the time you get to Sagat, the game's difficulty kicks into overdrive, and the only consistent way I've been able to win the final fight against Bison is to retreat into a corner and jump kick over and over. That, by the way, was the exact same strategy I used as a teenager to beat the Super NES ports of Street Fighter II and Street Fighter II Turbo. Glad to see some things don't change. Despite the punishing movie battle mode, Street Fighter the movie was the best fighter available for the PlayStation at launch. It looks ridiculous, but it plays pretty much exactly like Super Street Fighter II Turbo otherwise, putting it a step ahead of the simplistic Battle Arena Toshinden. Capcom apparently didn't have much faith in the game, handing it off to Acclaim for publishing outside of Japan, but it isn't bad at all, and you can certainly do far worse in terms of 2D fighters on PlayStation. These days though, if digitized graphics don't do anything for you, you should probably just play one of the Street Fighter Alpha games instead. Oh, and one last thing. Street Fighter the movie introduces an original character named Captain Sawada. This is his super move. God, that's so good.
Sawada wins.
Strangely enough, I think Raiden's popularity is tied directly to the way it was originally distributed in North America. Raiden was published stateside by a company named Fabtech, an arcade cabinet distributor who had an unusually keen eye for quality games from lesser-known Japanese developers at the time. Fabtech produced North American versions of games like TAD Corporation's platformer Toki and the trackball-controlled shooter Cabal, along with a handful of other games throughout the late 80s and early 90s. I remember games like Toki and Cabal showing up at convenience stores, gas stations, and laundromats much more often than in dedicated video arcades, at least here in the American South anyway. I suspect that Fabtech focused on distributing its games via less traditional channels like arcade cabinet rental services, earning their games a sort of niche appeal back in the day. Fabtech had an established relationship with developer Seibu Kaihatsu, having previously published North American versions of their games Dynamite Duke and Dead Angle. Raiden was the third game produced in this collaboration between Seibu and Fabtech. I'd assume it was a pretty big success for both companies, given by just how often I saw it in the stores around my neighborhood when I was a kid. Fabtech's distribution muscle must have played a role in Raiden's success, because gameplay-wise, it offered little that hadn't been seen before in arcade shoot-'em-ups. Gameplay is inspired by contemporary shooters developed by Japanese studio Toaplan. In particular, it borrows thematic elements and gameplay concepts from Toaplan's Twin Hawk and Fire Shark, both of which were released a year earlier in 1989. These games focus on encounters with ground-based enemy targets, a key feature that made Raiden much more mechanically interesting than the carbon copy spaceship shooters that dominated the 1980s. Whether it's because of its weirdo gas station mystique or its quality gameplay, Raiden was an established hit, and a sequel arrived in 1993. Unlike the original Raiden, though, Raiden 2 was never ported to 16-bit consoles at the time. Considering the popularity of the series and the lack of arcade-perfect ports of either game, it made sense for Sony to launch a compilation with the PlayStation in North America in 1995. That's the Raiden Project, a straightforward port of Raiden 1 and 2 that offers little in the way of extra content, aside from optional remix soundtracks and some added presentation options. It's pretty bare bones compared to later retro compilations like the Namco Museum series, but it gets the job done. This wouldn't be the last time Sony would lead off a console launch with a retro shoot-'em-up compilation, either. Konami released the shooter Twin Pack Gradius 3 and 4 shortly after the North American launch of the PlayStation 2 in 2000. The Raiden Project and Gradius 3 and 4 both targeted a hardcore player base with well-designed ports of arcade shoot-'em-ups that didn't receive entirely accurate or complete home ports during the previous console generation. I seem to remember both games being poorly received at release, too. Critics at the time dismissed both games for sticking to established formulas instead of using the raw power of the PlayStation, or PS2, to show off their 3D capabilities. Some outlets even gave the collections low review scores, despite the fact that they both offer competent ports of worthwhile arcade shoot-'em-ups. It's a pretty good demonstration of how expectations and hype can skew popular opinion regarding console launch titles, in spite of their objective quality. This is also why it helps to look back on these kind of things with an eye for history, since it lets you better appreciate games within a more informed context. Personally, I didn't think much of the Raiden project after its release in 1995, but I appreciate its existence much more nowadays, especially considering that Raiden 2 was impossible to emulate up until recently. Raiden was such a popular arcade game that it was frequently pirated, leading Seibu to heavily encrypt the program data for the sequel. As a result, the PC arcade emulator MAME could easily reproduce a perfect version of the original Raiden, but the sequel was not emulated until late in 2014. At one time, the Raiden project was one of your very few options if you wanted to play Raiden 2 outside of an arcade. Of the 10 launch titles for the original PlayStation in North America, the Raiden project was one of the most historically significant. It tied a pair of well-known and highly regarded arcade games to new console hardware, effectively bridging the gap between the 16-bit and 32-bit eras. In many ways, Total Eclipse Turbo is a landmark game. It's the first PlayStation release from Crystal Dynamics, a studio that produced dozens of games throughout the 32-bit era. It's among the first PlayStation games to be ported from another console. It's also technically the very first PlayStation game released in North America. Total Eclipse Turbo hit store shelves on August 30th, 1995, almost 2 weeks before the US launch of the PlayStation hardware itself. Total Eclipse was originally released for the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, a 32-bit console that debuted in 1993. History hasn't been kind to the 3DO, but compared to other, lesser consoles from the era, like the CDI and the Atari Jaguar, it actually wasn't that bad of a system. The 3DO could render texture map 3D graphics, it had some decent exclusives, and even its worst games are at least memorable failures. Launching the console at a retail price of $700 may not have been the best idea, though, and it never gained the kind of market share that the PlayStation or even the Sega Saturn had. The 3DO had a handful of talented studios in its corner, though, including Crystal Dynamics. Based in San Francisco, Crystal Dynamics produced several 3DO games that are widely regarded as being among the best for the system, including Gex, The Horde, and Crash and Burn. Total Eclipse made the jump from 3DO to PlayStation with no major issues, and if nothing else, it's a solid conversion thanks to porting assistance from Beam Software and future PlayStation 4 hardware architect Mark Cerny. While Total Eclipse Turbo is a historically significant release, it's not that great of a game. It's a rail shooter in the vein of Nintendo's Star Fox. You control a spacecraft that flies through a series of forward-scrolling stages, and you're armed with an arsenal of weapons that you can upgrade with power-ups scattered throughout each level. Total Eclipse comes up short even compared to Star Fox, though. It's up to the player to determine the pacing of the game, and it always feels like you're either going too fast or too slow. Your energy meter slowly drains throughout each level, and it refills slightly with every enemy you kill. Ideally, you'd want to speed through each level using as little energy as possible while picking off whatever enemies you can along the way. The back of the game's case hints at this mechanic with the cheesy tagline, "The more you kill, the better you feel." It's true enough, I guess. It's an interesting gameplay dynamic, but in practice, this turns out to be pretty frustrating. You end up either losing all of your energy because you're going too slow and you become an easy target for the enemy craft, or you run out of energy because you're going too fast and you end up colliding with the level geometry. There's never any kind of balance to the gameplay, and you never feel like you're in full control of what's going on. The twitchy flight controls don't help, and it's difficult to judge how close you can fly to floors and walls without bouncing off and taking damage. It doesn't get any better as you go on, either. Here's a few seconds of footage I managed to capture from the last level before quitting in frustration. If you bother to make it this far, Total Eclipse shows off its contempt for the player with a long series of branching paths, most of which lead to instant death at unmarked dead ends. Finishing the game basically involves memorizing a complex flight path that you can only piece together by dying over and over again. Even better, if you lose all of your continues here, you'll need to repeat 3 entire stages before you're given another chance to try and beat the last level again. Great design there, guys. Thanks. Appreciate it. Crystal Dynamics would follow up on Total Eclipse with Off-World Interceptor, another forward-scrolling rail shooter that puts you behind the wheel of some sort of space buggy instead of a spaceship. We'll cover that one soon enough. While Total Eclipse was never ported to the Sega Saturn, a sequel, Solar Eclipse, was a Saturn exclusive. The series ended there, and Crystal Dynamics shifted its focus away from shooters afterward. Total Eclipse is really only notable for launching alongside the PlayStation and for being a showpiece for the 3DO, in other words. However, Total Eclipse was the first of many Crystal Dynamics games for the PlayStation. The studio later produced better-known PS1 games like Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, Pandemonium, and Soul Reaver. Much later on, Crystal Dynamics took over the Tomb Raider franchise from its original creator, Core Design. As of 2015, Crystal Dynamics remains a powerful force in the games industry, decades after the humble release of Total Eclipse Turbo.
Hey, pal, walk it off!
Ridge Racer was one of the first 8 PlayStation games released in Japan in 1994, and it later premiered as a launch title in North America and Europe. It played a key role in the PlayStation's success worldwide, proving that the hardware could deliver faithful ports of contemporary arcade games. This was an important point to establish, as arcade hardware at the time had become too difficult for 16-bit consoles to replicate, often resulting in substandard ports of 90s arcade games. Ridge Racer hit arcades in 1993, arriving a year before Sega's breakthrough arcade racer, Daytona USA. Ridge Racer 2, a slightly upgraded version of Ridge Racer 1 featuring some design tweaks and networked play for 2 or more players, also launched in 1994. Namco's PlayStation port is based largely on Ridge Racer 2, minus the multiplayer mode. For its time, Ridge Racer was a real achievement. It gave a genuine sense of speed during gameplay while showcasing some impressive visuals. Arcade racers had made early attempts at polygonal 3D in the late 80s and early 90s, with games like Atari's Hard Drivin' and Sega's Virtua Racing. Namco, having established a basic formula for arcade driving games with 1982's Pole Position, produced a number of similar games in the years leading up to Ridge Racer, including Suzuka 8 Hours, Final Lap, and Winning Run. Early 3D racers used flat-shaded polygons, and their low frame rates often didn't give the sense of speed that racing games need. Ridge Racer, then, was a revelation, pushing out texture-mapped polygons while still maintaining a solid frame rate and a great sense of speed. Until Daytona USA showed up, this was pretty much the new standard for arcade racers. The PlayStation version of Ridge Racer loses little in the transition from arcade to console. Unfortunately, it doesn't gain much either. It's a pretty straightforward port, and there's really only one racetrack in the entire game. Sure, you can race across multiple difficulty levels, and the higher difficulty settings add an extra section of track full of tight corridors and twisting turns, but otherwise you're stuck racing on the same stretch of road for the entire game. But back in 1995, that didn't matter all that much. The game is, at its core, fun enough to make up for the lack of content, and there's some PlayStation exclusive extras that make the home port worthwhile. After completing the game's first 4 challenges, you unlock an additional 4 stages. Here, you race on the same racetrack as you did before, but you do it backwards. This was something you couldn't do in the original arcade game. The TT Extra course is another unlockable challenge, and it's brutal. It takes place at night with limited visibility, and pits you against a super fast rival car that'll zoom past you and easily win if you don't physically block it with your own vehicle during every second of the race. If you do somehow manage to beat the car, you'll unlock it for play, and you'll find out that it has the best stats of any vehicle in the game. Namco did all that it could to make Ridge Racer a good fit for consoles, in other words, but the limited amount of content in the arcade original meant that the porting staff had little to work with. Still, that didn't stop me from playing the game for hours and hours until I finally unlocked everything back in the 90s. Ridge Racer also has a bunch of little idiosyncrasies that give it a unique personality. The game opens with a loading screen featuring a playable version of Namco's 1979 arcade shooter Galaxian. If you can shoot down all of the enemies before the loading is finished, you unlock 8 additional cars. And since the game never has to access the disc after its initial load time, you can open the PlayStation's lid and replace the Ridge Racer disc with any audio CD and listen to your own tracks during the race. While Ridge Racer lacks the sort of depth you'd expect from a racing game even back in 1995, it makes up for it in terms of presentation and polish. It's fast and fluid, and it's just plain fun to play. Ridge Racer set high standards for arcade ports on the PlayStation, and Namco followed up in the months after its launch with equally solid conversions of many of its most popular arcade games. If you want context for ESPN Extreme games, all you need to do is look at Road Rash by Electronic Arts. Originally released for the 16-bit Sega Genesis, Road Rash was a combat-oriented motorcycle racing series that saw a graphically overhauled 1994 release on the 3DO. Both Extreme games and 1994's Road Rash used a mixture of polygons, pre-rendered sprites, and 90s tood to achieve similar results. You can see in the footage here that the games share an aesthetic, and they both focus on battling other racers. A port of Road Rash would eventually hit the PlayStation in its first year on the market, but at launch, if you wanted a racing game that allowed you to punch and kick the competition, your only option was ESPN Extreme Games. That's all Extreme Games is in concept, but it forges its own identity in execution. Players pick one of 4 extreme modes of transport and compete in races across 5 exotic vacation spots across the globe, including South America, Rome, and, Utah. Utah's pretty extreme too, I guess. In terms of racing gear, your options include mountain bikes, inline skates, skateboards, and the now all but forgotten street luge. No matter which you pick, you're placed in a pack of 15 competing racers who use a mixture of equipment, and you've got to smack your way through them on the way to the finish line. While there's combat in ESPN Extreme Games, you also need to pass through gates found throughout each course in order to make progress. Yellow gates give you points, increasing your standings in the seasonal rankings. Green gates give you cash you can use to purchase better equipment, and blue gates act as switches, removing obstacles in your path and sometimes opening up shortcuts. While the game's mix-and-match approach to sporting equipment is interesting in concept, it's actually really unbalanced. The mountain bike will vault over smaller obstacles it strikes, for instance, while skateboarders and inline skaters will trip and fall, losing them several seconds as they recover. Street lugers have it even worse, since pretty much everything on the track is a deadly hazard to them. They can't even jump. These courses are actually really impractical for street lugers. I'd imagine slamming into a stack of tires feet first at 90 miles an hour is a great way to break both of your legs, along with most of the other bones in your body. Seriously, just stick with the bike. ESPN Extreme Games was the first PlayStation game credited to Sony Interactive Studios America, an in-house team based in Foster City, California. The same team also created other early PS1 sports games like NFL Game Day and NHL Face-Off before it was rebranded as 989 Studios. We'll see these guys again in this series before too long. ESPN Extreme Games was produced as part of an existing licensing agreement between ESPN and Sony. Before it established Sony Interactive Studios America, Sony produced a handful of ESPN licensed sports games for the Sega Genesis, Super NES, and Sega CD in the early 90s under its Sony ImageSoft publishing label. The sequel to ESPN Extreme Games dropped the ESPN license when it premiered in 1996 as Too Extreme. Sony also opted to not renew the license when it came time to re-release Extreme Games as part of its greatest hits budget line, cutting the game's FMV sequences, dropping all ESPN logos, and relaunching it as One Extreme. So, about those FMV sequences. ESPN Extreme Games has a bunch of video clips that play before and after each race, and they exist only to crush your self-esteem. This lady is ruthless, and she'll yell at you whenever you finish anywhere outside the top 3.
I didn't know these things had reverse. This is a race.
Finish last and you're pretty much a worthless sack of trash.
Last. Absolutely, positively, the last person to finish the race. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Don't think so, scrub.
And God help you if you finish in 14th place.
Yeah, I'm really glad we all wasted our time and came out here and watched you race like that. I hope your family wasn't watching.
Jesus. You're probably going to get yelled at a lot if you pick the easy difficulty mode, since easy in this context means you're making it easy for the competition to stomp all over you. Even if you make few mistakes, the computer-controlled players are always going to be far ahead of you in the race, and you have few opportunities to catch up. Playing on hard or extreme mode is actually a little easier because of the strange way Extreme Games handles difficulty. See, harder difficulty modes place more obstacles on each track, and hard and extreme modes place so much crap in your way that your AI-controlled opponents can't dodge it all. You'll often speed past large clumps of computer players who aren't programmed to deal with the harder difficulties, and end up getting stuck together. In addition to a single-player exhibition mode, Extreme Games features a split-screen versus mode for 2 players. It lowers the graphical detail and cuts back on the frame rate, but otherwise it works fine if you've got a buddy who has the patience to sit through the game's long tracks, which can take upwards of 6 or 7 minutes to complete. There's also a season mode that puts you on a repeating circuit across all of the game's tracks. Passing through green gates and racking up cash in this mode is crucial, as your opponents will also be upgrading their gear throughout. One other noteworthy thing about Extreme Games is that it's one of the first PlayStation games that allows you to save your progress to a memory card. These things weren't bundled with the system at launch, and you had to buy them separately for $20 each. They're almost comically small in terms of storage, offering 1 megabit of writable space. This space was divided up into blocks, and each card could hold up to 15 blocks of save data. Depending on the types of games you play and the save files you're creating, you ran the risk of filling up a memory card very quickly. ESPN Extreme Games' save data takes up 1 memory card block, while Maxis' A-Train fills up all 15 blocks of a single memory card. Many of the first PlayStation games gave players the choice of using passwords instead of memory cards, including ESPN Extreme Games. But there's a quirk in the way Extreme Games handles passwords that allows you to input random codes until you find one that works. You often end up with some really glitchy results. Here I'm continuing a season I didn't start, riding a non-existent bike that I bought with infinite money. So, what does it look like when you ride a bike that doesn't exist? Oh. Despite its obvious attempt to bite Road Rash's style, Extreme Games has a mid-90s charm of its own, and it's still decently fun to play. Extreme Games spawned 2 sequels before Sony laid the series to rest in 1999. That's the same year that Activision launched Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which took the extreme sports genre in a new direction and became one of the PlayStation's defining franchises. In 1995, Extreme Games was just a little bit ahead of its time, and today it serves as an overlooked predecessor to something much greater. Every nerd dreads having to talk about professional sports in any context, but hopefully I can make it sound like I know what I'm talking about here. The PlayStation launched in North America with 2 sports games on September 9th, 1995. One of them is a port of a popular arcade game, and it's pretty good. The other is, by far, the worst game in the PS1's launch lineup. We'll get to that thing in a bit. Let's get the good stuff out of the way first. NBA Jam Tournament Edition is a PlayStation port of developer Midway's 1993 arcade game featuring real-world basketball teams and players. NBA Jam expands on concepts introduced in Midway's 1989 arcade basketball game Arch Rivals, featuring 2-on-2 action in a horizontally scrolling court. Like Arch Rivals, NBA Jam takes the basic rules of basketball and twists them for a fast-paced, aggressive take on the sport. Defense involves sticking closely to your opponents and shoving them around until they drop the ball. Once you have possession, you need to zip over to the opposite side of the court to get a shot off quickly, and with as little resistance as possible. Arch Rivals was already pretty over the top, but NBA Jam goes into cartoonish territory with high-flying dunks, a turbo button that gives your players a speed boost, and running commentary from an over-caffeinated announcer. One of the game's most notable features was that it included digitized player likenesses, in addition to their real names and team affiliations. Player faces were captured and then pasted onto in-game character models for a distinctive graphic style, and the game included a big head cheat code that made matches even more ridiculous looking. The console versions of NBA Jam TE even included a mammoth head mode that actually makes the game much harder to play. NBA Jam Tournament Edition was launched as an upgrade kit in arcades in 1993, improving on the base game with an expanded roster and new mechanics like substitutions and player fatigue. It also added a tournament mode that disabled the original NBA Jam's controversial computer assistance feature, which gave the losing team an advantage in the middle of a match if their opponent pulled too far ahead in points. This was an arcade game, remember, so it needed to keep games close, so as to encourage players to spend more quarters. NBA Jam was popular in its time, and it was ruthless in its demand for cash in arcades, charging each player additional credits between every period of a 4-quarter game. Home ports then were in huge demand, and publisher Acclaim's adaptations for the Super NES and Sega Genesis were big sellers. But the game's reliance on digitized visuals and speech made it difficult to port to 16-bit consoles, and most adaptations came up short with tiny players, limited animation, and repetitive commentary. Of the many console ports available, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions of NBA Jam Tournament Edition are probably the best. The characters are large and detailed, the commentary is all there, and the action is pretty much spot on. If you were disappointed with the 16-bit versions of NBA Jam, the PlayStation port is a massive improvement. Along with Ridge Racer, NBA Jam Tournament Edition established the PlayStation as a very capable machine when it came to ports of modern arcade games. This isn't to say that the PlayStation version of NBA Jam TE is perfect, though. Supposedly in the rush to meet the PlayStation's launch, a bug slipped through that reversed the difficulty settings in the options menu. Put it on the easiest setting and you'll get wrecked by super difficult computer teams. Though, honestly, I didn't fare much better with the other difficulty settings. The computer plays really aggressively in this version no matter which difficulty you choose, making it hard to keep possession for more than a few seconds at a time. Of course, this doesn't really matter if you're playing a full 4-player game. NBA Jam TE was the first PS1 game to support the PlayStation Multitap, an accessory available at the console's launch in North America. It featured 4 controller ports and 4 memory card slots, letting all players load their own individual save data and stats. This was actually a pretty convenient solution in its time, since the 16-bit versions of NBA Jam locked player stats to a single cartridge's battery backup. The PlayStation's memory card allowed players to transport their save data across multiple copies of the game, making it easy to set up multiplayer sessions away from home. The PlayStation version of NBA Jam Tournament Edition also featured a whole bunch of codes, secrets, and hidden characters, letting you compete in some pretty weird matchups. Here you can see the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air himself, Will Smith, taking on then US First Lady Hillary Clinton. Man, Hillary got some moves. Early revisions of the original arcade version of NBA Jam TE went into even stranger territory with codes that unlocked characters from Midway's gory digitized fighting game Mortal Kombat. The NBA apparently wasn't too happy about having a bunch of playable serial killers in its game, so the Mortal Kombat characters were dropped for Tournament Edition's home ports. So, I've spent a lot of time talking about NBA Jam, but I can't delay the inevitable any longer. This is the other sports game available for the PlayStation's 1995 launch in North America. Power Serve 3D Tennis. Ugh. Power Serve 3D Tennis was one of only 2 games published by British company Ocean Software for the PlayStation in North America, though several more Ocean-published games later launched for the PS1 in Europe. Ocean has a lot in common with infamous American publisher LJN. Both companies produced a ton of licensed crap based on films, TV shows, and cartoons in the 80s and 90s, though Ocean mostly stuck to releasing games for home computers like the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. While a lot of Ocean's licensed games were terrible, its computer ports of arcade games like Renegade and Rainbow Islands are apparently pretty well regarded overseas. Of course, if you were a Nintendo fan in the United States back then, you probably know Ocean as the publisher of awful Super Nintendo games like Lethal Weapon, Cool World, and Dennis the Menace. Power Serve 3D Tennis doesn't feature real-world players or tennis courts, but it's every bit as bad as the licensed disasters that made Ocean Software infamous. I'm not gonna mince words here, this game is trash. It's not like tennis games were all that great back then either. 16-bit tennis games had barely progressed beyond the simple mechanics found in Nintendo's Tennis for the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System. Aside from some standouts like Super Tennis for the Super NES and World Court Tennis for the TurboGrafx 16, the genre was pretty much stagnant up until the release of Sega's Virtua Tennis in the late 90s. In other words, Power Serve 3D Tennis had low standards to meet, and it still failed in every regard. It's really difficult to hit the ball, and while the 3D characters are large and somewhat detailed, they animate strangely, and it's hard to move them with any degree of accuracy since they slide around a lot. There's also a 2-player mode, which is pretty much unplayable by default. The player on the opposite side of the court actually has their controls reversed. You push left on the D-pad to move right, and right moves left. It makes no sense. If you want to make the game any less than completely unfair in 2-player mode, you basically have to enter a secret code to enable a split-screen mode, so that player 2 doesn't have to use reversed controls. To do that, you need to pause the game and then press select. This feature isn't documented in the game itself, so if your copy doesn't include an instruction manual, you might never know about it. So, are there any redeeming qualities in Power Serve 3D Tennis? Well, it has some really bizarre player names, I guess. Here you can see Julia Cappuccino teaming up with Bart Sunrise. What? And then there's the music, which... Here, listen. I'm also a fan of the doubles mode here. Since players don't have any collision detection, you can just kinda mash them together and create ungodly freaks of nature. You have to make your own kind of fun in this game, I guess. For real though, you have no reason to ever play this thing. So that's the PlayStation Sports lineup at launch. One game that showcases the PlayStation's ability to deliver accurate arcade ports, and another that's emblematic of the kind of low-effort crap that would flood the market in the console's later years. I gotta admit, there's a certain kind of beauty in this tiny microcosm representing the PlayStation's legacy. Yeah, beauty. That's the word for it. And now we come to one of the most historically important games in the PlayStation's launch lineup. This is Rayman, a side-scrolling action game from Ubisoft. Unlike many of the PlayStation's earliest games, Rayman didn't attempt to break new ground in 3D space. It focuses squarely on an established genre, the mascot-driven 2D platformer. At the time, the mascot platformer had reached the height of its popularity on the Super NES and Sega Genesis, and Rayman debuted right as 2D side-scrollers were on the verge of a quick decline. Rayman is a real standout visually. Its painted backgrounds are vibrantly colorful, and its sprites are very well animated compared to similar games at the time. Part of the reason why Rayman's aesthetic works so well on the PlayStation is due to its unique character design. Most characters in Rayman don't have limbs, leaving their hands and feet floating independently. This creates an illusion of fluid movement. This also had the benefit of bypassing technical hurdles. The PlayStation's limited amount of RAM meant that developers could devote very little space to animating 2D sprites, something that wasn't a problem for cartridges but would prove to be a challenge for the CD-ROM format. Rayman's stylistic choices were an ideal solution in this case. Rayman was created by Michel Ancel, a graphic designer who would later go on to direct games like Beyond Good and Evil. Rayman is very much an artist-driven game. You can see this reflected in its detailed environments, its clever enemy designs, and the variety of interactive elements within each level. Some of these levels place Rayman in surreal, otherworldly settings. This gave the designers more freedom in creating level layouts since they didn't need to work within a clearly defined physical space. I like that these levels have backing audio tracks that are mostly percussion with limited musical accompaniment. Even when it makes a hard turn toward the surreal, Rayman has a really strong, consistent style throughout, and I think that's what makes it so memorable. Rayman played a critical role in the rise of Ubisoft, a French company that was all but unknown at the time in other parts of the world. Originally established in the 1980s as a small mail-order outlet, Ubisoft soon struck licensing deals with publishers like Electronic Arts, Lucasfilm, and Sierra Online to distribute French versions of popular PC games. By the time Rayman had started development, Ubisoft was the largest software distributor in France. If you look at Ubisoft's release schedule at this point, you'll notice that the company greatly scaled back its distribution business in the years leading up to Rayman's release. In the late 80s and early 90s, Ubisoft was producing only a handful of its own internally developed games every year. At the same time, it was pushing out French versions of dozens of games from other companies. This came to a sudden halt around 1994, which saw the release of only a small number of internally developed console games from Ubisoft. By the time 1995 rolled around, Rayman was basically the only major game Ubisoft had slated for release. I initially thought that this sudden downturn in its release schedule was a sign of trouble at Ubisoft, and that Rayman's success reversed its fortunes. But it seems more likely that Ubisoft was instead cashing in on its success as a distributor of games and reallocating its resources in a bid to establish itself as a major player in the industry. A 1993 article in Electronic Gaming Monthly paints Ubisoft as being on the verge of a major breakout as it shifted its focus to internal development of games for consoles. Looking at the games Ubisoft developed back in the 80s and 90s, Rayman represents a remarkable leap forward for the company. Up until this point, Ubisoft's internally developed releases tended to be simple arcade-style games and puzzlers, along with the occasional medieval strategy game in the vein of Cinemaware's Defender of the Crown, which Ubisoft distributed in France. Ubisoft was banking on Rayman to become a major success, but it took many years and multiple development setbacks before it finally launched in the form that we're familiar with. As you can see here in the screenshots from French magazine Pix and Love, Rayman was originally envisioned as a Super NES game. Years into its development, Ubisoft scrapped the Super Nintendo version and announced Rayman as an exclusive for the Atari Jaguar, a cartridge-based console that sold poorly and only saw a handful of games released before it was discontinued in 1996. Ubisoft apparently saw the writing on the wall with the Jaguar before Rayman's release, and began developing ports for the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and DOS PCs, which were released around the same time. The years of work that went into Rayman's development paid off in a big way. Rayman ranked as a top 40 seller across all platforms in the United Kingdom for 261 weeks, the longest any game has ever charted in the region. It's been 160 weeks in the top 20. Rayman also has the honor of being the single biggest selling PlayStation game of all time in the UK. That's right, a launch-era 2D PlayStation game outsold Tomb Raider 2, Gran Turismo, and other games that arrived after the console had achieved mainstream success. There must be something about Rayman that resonated with audiences in Europe especially, because I don't recall it having the same impact here in North America. It sold well enough to earn a re-release as part of Sony's greatest hits label, and critics liked it at the time, but I rarely see it mentioned in discussions about the PS1's all-time greats. I suppose it's a logical extension of the sort of mascot platformers you saw on European computers at the time. Rayman has more in common with, say, Zool than it does with Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog. Rayman was a major success on PlayStation, and it was a smash hit on PCs, where it was a consistent moneymaker years after its initial release. By 1999, Rayman had sold more than 3 million copies worldwide thanks to frequent reissues and compilations like Rayman Designer and Rayman Forever. Each subsequent PC version of Rayman added a collection of new levels to the base game, including several fan-made maps designed using the official level creation toolkit Rayman Mapper. It's kind of amazing to think that so many people played and apparently enjoyed Rayman because the game itself is brutally difficult. The first world isn't so bad. It's actually a pretty solid mix of platforming challenges that do a good job of teaching players how to use Rayman's unique abilities. Starting in the second world, though, Rayman becomes much tougher. Levels are filled with instant kill pits and spikes, and new platforming gimmicks and traps are introduced throughout. By the time you get to the game's later levels, you'll be dying many times between checkpoints. One of Rayman's more annoying mechanics is its habit of spawning enemies and obstacles from nowhere, often placing them directly in your path with little warning. This isn't a technical limitation or a programming bug. If Rayman passes through one of many invisible tripwires throughout each level, a specific sound cue will play, and new enemies and traps will suddenly appear to make things more difficult. In one way, spawning enemies directly in front of the player is a bold move that challenges what's usually expected from the platforming genre. It creates unpredictable moments that require improvisation on the player's part, and the high level of challenge makes finishing the tougher levels very satisfying. On the other hand, Rayman often feels like a game for experts who have already mastered many other platformers. In assuming mechanical mastery, Rayman focuses on trial and error gameplay and memorization of enemy spawn points. Gameplay grows more complex as Rayman earns new abilities, too. A later level in Rayman might ask you to make a perfectly timed running jump and helicopter spin in the air for added distance, so that you can grab and swing from a floating ring and land on a faraway platform. All of this, of course, frequently takes place over bottomless pits, and if you hesitate at any point or collide with an enemy that spawned mid-jump, you're gonna fall and lose a life. Bosses are another major roadblock. Each boss in Rayman takes many hits to kill, and they lower their defenses very rarely, so fights can take several minutes. The entire time you're dodging tricky attack patterns that grow more difficult as the fight goes on. It's also worth noting that these bosses are found at the end of levels that are already extremely challenging to begin with. Every level in Rayman consists of a series of short stages that ramp up in difficulty. So let's say that after hours of practice, you finally reach segment 5 out of 6 segments in a given level. If you lose all your lives there, you need to start all over from segment 1. Boss levels are like this too. You can spend a long time working your way up to a boss only to drain all of your lives pretty much instantly because you haven't learned their attack patterns yet. To earn a rematch, you need to go all the way through the preceding levels again, and given the difficulty of the boss fights, you probably won't beat the boss on your second attempt either. The game's latter half especially has some of the most challenging stages I've seen in any video game. This level here has a long auto-scrolling sequence that competes with the worst of Donkey Kong Country's minecart levels, at least in terms of sheer hatefulness. Another level gives you very limited visibility, and of course you're surrounded by instant kill pits. And the final boss, Mr. Dark, brings to mind the difficult Dracula boss fights at the end of Castlevania games. Seriously, I swear this part is ripped straight from Castlevania 3. Rayman's creator, Michel Ancel, acknowledged the game's steep challenge in an interview conducted just before the release of Rayman Origins. He claims that the original Rayman's high degree of difficulty is due to a lack of thorough testing. Apparently, the designers themselves would test the levels, and being experts with thousands of hours of playtime between them, they didn't notice the game's severe difficulty spikes. If you want to enjoy Rayman nowadays, I recommend using a built-in cheat code that gives you 99 lives. You'll still die a lot between checkpoints, but at least you'll save yourself the frustration of having to repeat entire levels because you ran out of lives. If you don't want to suffer through it yourself, I recommend watching the speedrun I've linked in the description below. The runner, Spike Vegeta, does a good job of explaining what makes the game as difficult as it is, and the run itself has a bunch of really dramatic, unexpected moments that make it really fun to watch. Despite its unrelenting difficulty, Rayman was a major success for Ubisoft, and a sequel entered production soon after. Originally planned as another 2D platformer, Rayman 2 eventually shifted to 3D before launching for the Nintendo 64 and PCs in 1999. If you play the later PlayStation port of Rayman 2, you can actually unlock a level from the cancelled 2D version. Rayman saw a couple more 3D sequels and spin-offs afterwards. One scrapped sequel was later reworked to become Rayman Raving Rabbids, which established a template for literally hundreds of Wii minigame compilations that would come afterward from Ubisoft and pretty much every other publisher in the world at the time. While Rayman's creator, Michel Ancel, was credited in Raving Rabbids, he was not involved in the development of the finished product. Ancel would later return in a director's role for Rayman Origins, a 2D platformer that looks and plays a whole lot like the original Rayman, only it has a more friendly difficulty curve and gives players unlimited tries to finish each level. Ubisoft followed up on Rayman Origins in 2013 with another 2D sequel, Rayman Legends, which shares some eerie similarities with the circumstances surrounding the original Rayman's release. See, Rayman Legends was originally supposed to be an exclusive for Nintendo's Wii U console. After Raving Rabbids, Ubisoft released a string of successful games for the Nintendo Wii, and banked on the Wii U becoming a worthy successor console. When it wasn't, Ubisoft put the brakes on all future development for the Wii U and made Rayman Legends a multi-platform release, selling millions more copies as a result. And that's pretty much exactly what happened with the original Rayman. Would Ubisoft even exist today if Rayman had remained an exclusive to the Atari Jaguar? Considering that the company grew very quickly in the years after Rayman's release, the game's success likely played a significant role in Ubisoft's current status as the third largest video game publisher in the world. Rayman was an important milestone for the video games industry. It transformed a distributor of other people's games into a canny publisher with its own stable of high-quality, internally developed games, and the lessons Ubisoft learned with Rayman still apply today. Rayman Legends demonstrates that Ubisoft is still willing to overhaul its business plans in the event of unexpected market developments, something that it regarded with keen awareness even as far back as 1995 with the multi-platform release of Rayman.
What's the little lab rat up to this time?
And so, our look at the PlayStation's launch lineup ends not with a bang, nor with a whimper, but somewhere in between with Kileak, the DNA Imperative. Kileak is a mech-based first-person shooter that debuted first in Japan in January of 1995, and later became a PlayStation launch title in North America. It's worth noting that Kileak is the very first first-person shooter ever released for the PlayStation, in North America at least. In Japan, that honor goes to the hybrid dungeon crawler FPS Crime Crackers. We'll cover that one soon. Kileak is developed by Genki, a Japanese studio founded in 1990 by a couple of ex-SEGA employees. Before Kileak, Genki focused on the racing genre on the Super NES, creating games like Redline F1 Racer, Michael Andretti's IndyCar Challenge, and GP1. Genki later made a few games for the 3DO Interactive multiplayer before it started developing for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. As for why a developer known for its racing games suddenly shifted to first-person shooters for Kileak and its follow-ups, I'm guessing that Genki was contracted by Sony to fill a niche in the PlayStation's library, as Kileak is published by Sony Music Entertainment Incorporated in Japan. Sony also published the English-language versions in North America and Europe. Kileak doesn't deliver much in terms of story after the opening cinematic. A rogue scientist, Dr. Kim, is conducting some kind of forbidden genetic experiments at the South Pole, and as a member of the International Peacekeeping Force, you're out to stop him. Your transport gets shot down on the way, but you and a partner shrug off the crash landing and head into the Doctor's 15th-floor dungeon. As far as gameplay goes, well, as you can probably tell from the action here, it's no Doom. In fact, though it shares some superficial similarities with Doom, Kileak actually has more in common with contemporary mech games for the 3DO. Kileak seems to take specific inspiration from Iron Angel of the Apocalypse, a first-person shooter that launched for the 3DO in Japan in 1994. Coincidentally, Iron Angel of the Apocalypse also stars a robot-like character who's also trying to kill an evil scientist. Early 3D mech games weren't really known for their fast action. They tended to focus more on simulating the experience of piloting a mechanical suit of armor with a ton of firepower. This kind of became a thing during the 32-bit era in Japan, thanks in no small part to the popularity of mecha anime and manga series like Gundam and Macross, and the genre evolved quickly. Jumping ahead a couple of years, From Software's Armored Core took a more action-oriented approach to mech games in 1997. Capcom would later follow the concept to its logical conclusion with Steel Battalion, a first-person mech game for the original Xbox that required a massive control panel setup, complete with foot pedals and an emergency eject button. Back in 1995, though, 3D mech games often had a more deliberate pace. And while it can be argued that a slower pace more accurately simulates the experience of piloting a hulking metal death machine, Kileak just comes across as awkward and kind of unfair. Much of Kileak's gameplay involves exploring long stretches of identical corridors. At some point, you'll find a locked door that blocks the elevator to the next floor, and that's when you need to explore a bunch of side rooms until you find the keycard that you need to progress. You'll also find new weapons and armor upgrades along the way. It's simple enough in concept, but the enemies in each level will put up a real fight if you're not paying attention. Many ambush you in the middle of long hallways, leaving you no room to dodge or circle strafe. You'll just have to soak up bullets until you either retreat or kill the enemy. As you can see in the footage here, I eventually started tanking damage and focused on ending encounters as quickly as possible, instead of trying to fight strategically. Believe it or not, you actually lose less health that way. Other enemies are less threatening. The ones behind doors often get stuck on the level geometry as you enter, giving you a chance to take them out before they can attack. New enemies are introduced every floor or two, but there's little variation in their attack patterns. You're basically fighting the same robot types throughout the entire game. Actually, the lack of enemy variety and the boxy map layouts make Kileak seem less like a first-person shooter and more like a classic-style dungeon crawler with real-time combat. Strategy, if you can call it that, mostly boils down to ammo conservation and energy management. See, many of your weapons tap into your mech's battery life, so you need to carefully balance how much of your battery you want to spend on firepower before you switch to your guns that have limited ammunition. It's a solid enough gameplay structure in that it forces you to carefully explore dangerous territory with limited resources, but in practice it just becomes kinda dull after a while. Each level has at least one of these battery recharge stations, and once you find one, you're going to want to backtrack to it whenever you run low on battery life. The ideal way to play Kileak is to use battery-powered weapons as much as possible, so that you can save your bigger guns for boss fights. The problem is that backtracking is so slow. You can spend minutes in each level backtracking whenever your battery runs low, meaning that much of Kileak's gameplay boils down to retracing your steps through these long, featureless hallways. And if that's not enough, the entire time your onboard computer is reminding you every 5 seconds that your battery is running low. God, I know! And that's all there is to it, really. Kileak has 15 floors in total. The first 5 basically amount to a series of metal corridors, and floors 6 through 10 are pretty much exactly the same thing, only you're exploring underground caves instead. The rest of the floors in the game are a clever mixture of cave and corridor. I got to floor 9 before I ran out of patience with Kileak, mainly due to these creatures that fire at you from the ceiling. For some reason, you need to hold down the L1 and R1 buttons on the PlayStation controller at the same time to make your mech aim upward. This also locks you in place and makes you an easy target. It's around here where you start taking more damage in battle than you could ever hope to recover by killing enemies and collecting health pickups, and the whole thing just begins to feel kinda pointless. I guess the best thing about Kileak is its sense of isolation. You don't really encounter any human characters during the game, aside from the occasional comms call from your partner, and if it were executed just a little bit better, Kileak could actually be pretty creepy. I can see it being this really tense game where you're sneaking through an abandoned research station and ducking into side rooms to avoid patrolling robots. I assume the underground tunnels where the game takes place were full of human researchers at some point, and it'd be interesting to collect clues and piece together the events that led up to the robot takeover. This just doesn't happen in Kileak. It's pretty much just all shooting with very little story. There's barely even any puzzles to solve. There's a good premise here, but Genki couldn't quite pull it off in the end. What little story there is in Kileak is kinda messed up. As you go through the game, you find these audio logs that reveal that Dr. Kim is performing genetic experiments with this thing called Kileak.
Kim, what the hell are you doing? No one gave you the authority to go this far.
Shut up, you fool! Everything has changed. From now on, I'm the one in charge.
Kileak, you're mad. Who do you think you are? God?
Which is actually an ancient alien creature that spawned all life on Earth millions of years ago. He's doing this so that he can create a perfect race of superhumans with the aim of putting a forceful end to the non-stop ethnic conflicts and genocide that engulfs the planet in the game's timeline. By the way, this all happens years after a quote-unquote Middle Eastern country detonates a nuclear weapon in 2009. Another fun thing you'd never know about Kileak's story without reading the manual is that Dr. Kim's research is funded by a major multinational conglomerate that came to power as the race wars continued. Headquartered in Chile and rumored to be staffed by German immigrants, it invests the bulk of its profits into researching things like genetic engineering and human cloning. This corporation also happens to have strict hereditary requirements for leadership, and its director of operations is internally called the Führer. Subtle. Maybe Kilik pulls a bionic commando at the end and you get to shoot Hitler in the face. Anyway, less than a year after the launch of Kilik, Genki released a direct sequel in Japan, which later arrived stateside under the title Epidemic. From what I've seen of it, it seems very similar to the original Kilik, though it looks like it has bigger environments with wider hallways. I guess that was a common complaint. Critics at the time liked it about as much as they liked the original Kilik, which isn't saying much. A year after Epidemic, Genki released another first-person mech game, Brahma Force, The Assault on Belt Logger 9. Man, that's a chunky title right there. I remember this one being much faster paced than Kilik. It had a better variety of weapons, and you could actually jump, so you weren't just stuck sliding across metal floors the whole game like you were in Kilik. Genki never returned to mech simulators afterward because in between Epidemic and Brahma Force, the studio released a PlayStation game called Shutoko Battle: Drift King. The Shutoko Battle series was first introduced on the Super Famicom, but it became a huge hit on the PlayStation and spawned a whole bunch of sequels. The Shutoko Battle games have kind of a fractured history over here in North America, since new games in the series would get picked up by different publishers. These games would then get released under different titles, like Tokyo Extreme Racer, Tokyo Highway Battle, and Street Supremacy, leaving little clue to their lineage. The most recent console game in the series was released as Import Tuner Challenge on the Xbox 360. And so, like many other Japanese developers at the time, Genki eventually found its voice and direction on the PlayStation, but it wasn't with Kilik. At the time, developers struggled to follow through on ambitious game concepts while they were still coming to grips with new console hardware. Kilik isn't bad for a launch-era PlayStation game, but it proved that the mech simulation genre wasn't quite ready to blossom on consoles just yet. Luckily, with From Software's Armored Core just a few years away, mech fans wouldn't have long to wait for a worthwhile successor. And there you have it. Now you know more than you ever wanted to know about the 10 games that launched with the PlayStation in 1995. There's not really a clear winner that stands head and shoulders above the competition here, but if I had to pick a personal favorite, that would be Ridge Racer. I love everything about it, from its sense of speed, to its soundtrack, to its simple but effective drifting mechanics. It just highlights everything great about early-era PlayStation games. On the other hand, it's easy to single out the worst game in the bunch. That, of course, is Power Serve 3D Tennis. Even after coming back to it multiple times, I still can't manage to hit the ball consistently, which is kind of a problem in a tennis game. Even worse, we've got another tennis game coming up in a future episode that critics also hated, so that's something to look forward to, I guess. And, having now invested a lot of time into playing the PlayStation's launch games, here's how I'd rank them in terms of how much fun they are to play in 2015. Over the next few weeks, we'll be taking a look at the Japanese games that hit the PlayStation in 1994, very few of which were ever released in the West. If you like what you've seen, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We've got big plans for this channel in the future, and with your help, we can explore and document all kinds of fun stuff from the 32-bit era. If you fund us on Patreon, you'll get to see new episodes a week or more before they're released publicly. Support us by the end of this month and you'll get early access to our next episode where we look at Cosmic Race, a Japanese exclusive that at least one publication considers to be the worst game of all time. Is it as bad as they say it is? Well, it's the first and only game developed by a company that now makes time card software for Japanese businesses, so that should clue you in as to what kind of pain awaits us. That should be fun. We also stream weird games every week at our Twitch channel, so check that out if you want to see us play some stuff you've probably never seen before, including some really obscure PS1 games. Though I should also warn you that we're big fans of full motion video. Sorry, that's just something you'll have to accept about us. Anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon.